Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Conversations in Moral Theology. This is a show sponsored by New Wine, New Wineskins, an association for early career Catholic moral theologians, and the Catholic Moral Theology blog. I'm Alessandro Rovati, and today I'm joined by Kate Jackson-Meyer, who is the John and Daria Berry Postdoctoral Fellow at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. I've invited her to talk about her book, Tragic Dilemmas in Christian Ethics, which was recently published by Georgetown University Press. Kate, welcome to the Conversations in Moral Theology, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Alessandro. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you. So, as the title suggests, the book's goal is to fill a gap in Christian ethics, namely the absence of a sustained and precise analysis of moral dilemmas in general and tragic dilemmas in particular. Why did you perceive such a gap? What led you to wanting to explore it?
Thank you. Well, I think just the part of it comes from my experiences. So I would say I was very much formed by my experience after college as a Jesuit volunteer, and in the kind of just the volunteer work that I did and the other volunteers, I'm not sure that those were necessarily tragic dilemmas as I've defined them in the book, but it certainly woke me up to hard situations in the world, and I felt as if we didn't have a language to really explain what was happening, what we were seeing, and then our kind of inability to follow through on what seemed to be to us myriad obligations that we had. And so that just stayed with me for a very long time. And as I went through my studies, I kind of was very much drawn to different theories and thinking about moral complexity and moral ambiguity. And so eventually I turned to moral philosophy. And there I found a really robust and sustained treatment of moral and tragic dilemmas, more so moral dilemmas. And then I thought, wow, this is saying something that I've been trying to understand and grapple with, and what would it look like for theology to take this very seriously. And in particular, from moral philosophy, I was very much influenced by the work of Lisa Tessman and Burden Virtues and Moral Failure, and her trying to grapple with an Aristotelian framework and how far that can get us and also the limits. So then that was, really an invitation to bring that into specifically Thomistic thought, but also just theology in general.
Wonderful. So as your answer makes clear, there seems to be a commitment in you to think about moral theology in conversation with moral experiences. In the book, you say that moral experiences do not justify new categories in and of themselves because moral experiences are not self-justifying. But still, you make a claim and you build a sustained argument that moral experiences do need to prompt our investigation of our current ethical categories. Such an observation prompts a question that I think it's very important for contemporary debates, namely, when and how should theology handle insights from experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And as you say, I mean, you've explained it very well. Moral experience in general, emotions, those are not in and of themselves self-justifying. So it's important to recognize them. And I want to, think deeply about them, but that's not, how we ground our ethics or our theology. However, I think that it's really important. So one of the things that I take up in the book is the field of moral injury. So moral injury comes out of psychology to describe the experiences of veterans coming back from war who felt as if they had an experience, something, and it wasn't properly described by PTSD. It wasn't properly described by any of the categories that they had, and Jonathan Shea, Brett Litz, and others, describe this as moral injury. Now it's a huge field, and so this is to describe this special injury of coming back from war, where there's something else injured. It's not just your body; it's something about your morals, and I look at that, and moral injury itself is a broad category, and the kinds of cases that are included as morally injurious or potentially morally injurious are incredibly broad, from very clearly nefarious acts to not at all, to trying very well to act in the best way possible. So as an ethicist, we're really limited with what we can do with that whole category. But I took that it was very important to acknowledge that there were people coming back from war, veterans who were in these experiences of war, who absolutely were following, they were doing the best they could. They were following the rules of law. They were following the rules of war. They were following the principle of double effect. They were thinking about just war theory, whatever it was, and they still said to themselves, something's not right. And moral injury gives a language to describe that experience, and it's not a one-off. It's not just one person that came. This is a lot of people. Again, it's not every case of moral injury, but it's certainly people coming back saying, these categories that we had, I was out there, I did that, and that just wasn't enough. Furthermore, it also wasn't helpful to ignore that experience. So to say, oh, well, you might have felt that way, but we have the principle of double effect that can sort that out. Again, as that's not the reason to change our categories, but just to say there are a significant number of people with those experiences. That's just in war, but they're in other places as well. And so I wanted to take that seriously, to say, well, if they are bringing an insight to us, what would that mean? What would that mean for, are there tools in our theological frameworks? Are there insights from Augustine and Aquinas that could help us really take really seriously what they're saying and work through that? And so the category of tragic dilemmas isn't it an investigation that's inspired by real moral experience. But I don't think that the category itself is rooted in that. It's rooted in fundamental Christian commitments, and that is the theory itself. But I think that the real life experiences of people who said, well, the current categories just are not matching life, that prompted me to look more deeply into this.
Wonderful. And obviously we'll have a chance to discuss the category itself more in our conversation. Before I ask you a question about the category itself, though, another question about something that really interested me in your way of developing your argument. Together with experience, you give a prevalent role, a preeminent role, even to the reality of feelings and emotions. So what role do they play in the moral life? Why did you decide to give space to them in the way you did? How can we keep them into account while also reasoning about moral conundrums?
Yeah, and I don't think that any ethical theory, as you already explained my view, it's not rooted in these emotions, but the emotions are really important. And as Aquinas or Aristotle will tell us, a virtuous person is going to have not only right action, but right disposition and right emotions. So it's certainly part of the moral life. And so I think that emotions can point to something. They can help us understand some kind of objective moral reality that's going on. Our emotional responses. It doesn't mean that every emotional response does that, but I think that they're very important indicators about our interior moral lives, but also the morality of the world around us. It's important to take that seriously. And again, the moral emotions I'm looking at, it's not just one person necessarily who felt uncomfortable at war or something like that. This is, certainly a significant amount of people, which is why I think it's enough to kind of prompt emotion, to prompt the investigation based on this kind of sense, both a moral sense that maybe something wasn't quite right, but also an emotional sense. And I think that it's an important part of our ethics to think about our emotional lives. And so I just see that as helping us to kind of think more about what's happening.
Wonderful. So let's talk about moral dilemmas and tragic dilemmas. It's impossible to describe them fully, to summarize fully the whole arch of the book. But if you were to indicate the essential features of moral dilemmas and tragic dilemmas, what would they be?
Sure. So in a moral dilemma, one ought to do A and one ought to do B, but one can't do both. And a tragic dilemma is a moral dilemma that involves some sort of tragedy. And so I'm arguing specifically for tragic dilemmas in Christian ethics. Coming from moral philosophy, and also theology, but in moral philosophy, there is generally a notion that you can't have a moral dilemma because when you have this conflict, there's kind of a way to figure out what's the right action, and there are various kind of philosophical strategies for that. But you see kind of dilemma theorists challenging that in moral philosophy, saying, well, that's not quite right because an obligation can remain in some kind of way. So this idea about an enduring obligation is at the heart of a moral dilemma or a tragic dilemma. And so the category of tragic dilemmas that I'm arguing for are what I call non-negotiable obligations. And I use that coming from Lisa Tessman from moral philosophy. She proposes that there are negotiable obligations and there are non-negotiable obligations. And we could talk more about how those come about. But so I'm arguing that there are specifically this category of non-negotiable obligations in Christian thought. And these arise from Christian obligations to human life and human vulnerabilities. And because we have to protect those, when those obligations are at odds with each other, you can use and should use the ethical strategies to make the best choices possible. Or should act virtuously. However, that obligation not chosen for, it's going to remain because it's non-negotiable. And because these are obligations, these non-negotiable obligations are rooted in such profound things like human dignity and human vulnerability, it's a great tragedy when we cannot uphold those obligations. And so I'm saying that in Christian thought we have this, and there's specifically tragic dilemmas. So I don't want to argue for a broad category of moral dilemmas because then I think that we wouldn't be able to do anything. So there might be in daily life lots of conflicts of obligations. That's certainly the case. But lots of those are negotiable obligations that are in conflict, and I do think you can make the right decision, and then the obligation not chosen for, kind of, it falls away. Nothing's really lost. But when we have these non-negotiable obligations, the obligation remains, and there's tragedy, and that's what I'm arguing for.
Wonderful. So you argue that one of the main reasons why the Christian tradition has not paid sufficient attention or barely any attention to the existence of moral dilemmas is its focus on the idea that it is possible to discern competing duties and order them and their relative competing goods in ways that end up eliminating the agent's dilemma. Why do you find such arguments unpersuasive, those strategies unpersuasive?
So in the book, I use 9 cases, and I use them throughout the book to show kind of typical of these strategies used to solve those cases and why I think that those are insufficient. So one example, again, drawing from war, draws from the film Eye in the Sky, if you saw that. And so in this film, they're going to be doing a drone strike. The kind of geopolitics are rather complex, though, but just kind of getting into the heart of this issue. So they're going to do a drone strike on suicide bombers who they get intel are preparing for an attack. And as they're about to do the drone strike, they see that there's a little girl selling bread. She's right in front of the compound, and based on where the compound is and the bomb and where she is, we can assume that she would die. And you can see in the film that the drone pilot and many other people that are part of the chain of command are very hesitant to fire when you know that this girl's going to die. And something like that is typically covered by the principle of double effect, which would help us understand why that action is justified. It's ethical. There are different criteria to understand that. And the primary thing being that the intention is not to kill the girl. The intention is to save all the innocent people that are going to be saved when doing this drone strike. And so because of that, her death is, that kind of phrase of collateral damage or something. So and just to be clear, in the principle of double effect, you should be sad about that death. I mean, that's certainly, part of that. But as I think the film does a good job showing, and as kind of other evidence from moral injuries shows, is that it doesn't really seem to actually solve what is going on of that kind of ethical commitment that people have to that, in this case, the little girl. And so I don't think that this category of principle of double effect is able to really explain what's going on, to properly explain the way that obligations really work in that kind of situation. But also, I worry that something like the principle of double effect is just allowing us to zero in on this small situation, give some ethical strategy to solve it, and then it ignores the kind of much broader structural and social situations in which that occurs. And so we have, this appreciation for our social embeddedness and social ethics. And it's not as if Aquinas didn't understand that we were social beings or anything like that. But I think we have this kind of newer appreciation for the complexity of what it means to be social beings, and how it might be inappropriate to only think about the ethics of that situation based on that kind of moment in time and those small amounts of people who are acting. And really we have an obligation, I think, to broaden out and think of all of these other ways that we and society are involved in a decision like that. So for those reasons, I don't think that it's explaining moral experience and the nature of obligations properly, but also I think that it's overly focused on individual acts and actors, that I think that they're insufficient. And in the book, I go through other cases and other strategies as well.
Let me follow up on that, because one of the other central claims in the book is that dilemmas are not necessarily the result of individual sinfulness, but rather they are the product, and you were reflecting on this a moment ago, of social sinfulness, of structures in which the individual choice is embedded. This is an important concept, but also a somewhat recent concept. This idea of social sinfulness, at least it's becoming more and more prevalent in ethical conversations. Would you help us appreciate what the Christian tradition mean by social sinfulness, sinful structures? How do they relate to freedom, to agency? There is this whole set of new questions that we are asking as ethicists. What's your take on them?
Yeah. And so, in the book, I use a couple of theorists that I think are very helpful for helping us think about that, like Dan Finn and Daniel Daly, to help us think about what it means to be, but we have agency. I don't want to say we don't have agency, but we are embedded in these structures, and what does that really mean? So I think that Dan Daly does a good job kind of talking about how structures can encourage us to do or act in a sinful way or in a not sinful way. You can think about the way that structures kind of they form us or incentivize us to make certain actions easier or not so easy. And so you can think about how we are acting within these broader things, but at the same time having agency to make our own choices. So one of the concepts that I bring up, because as you say, this is complex, because it's both how I can act, how the structures are constraining my choices, but also just the ideas within the structure themselves. So kind of cultural ideas about what might be like the best action or not. And so kind of thinking about all of these pieces, but what we kind of think is possible within our own actions. So one of the examples in the book was from climate change, and so you can think about the structures that we have, making it easy or not easy to both make environmentally sound decisions, but also then just the framework about how we would even think about that, or like what's a reasonable way to think about it. So now just kind of talking here about on the book, like I'm part of many societies, and we have conferences, and so you need to fly, so now I'm embedded in a structure, and there's a kind of obligation that I have to my society to be there to talk about my book, but then at the same time that's going to require me to go on a plane. It's going to require all of us to go on a plane. Do I have agency to make that choice about going on an airplane? Absolutely. Is my society encouraging me to go on an airplane? Yeah, absolutely. And are there ideas within this society about that you have to be at conferences? Yes, there is. So those, I think, are the ways that these different parts are interacting.
Thank you so much. So I think one of the most immediate reactions against your arguments regarding the existence of moral dilemmas and tragic dilemmas in particular is that recognizing the existence of such dilemmas seem, and I emphasize the word seem, to run counter to the affirmation of things like moral absolutes, intrinsic evil, universal prohibitions. These are all categories that are very important in the Catholic tradition. How does your proposal interact with those concepts? Again, because I think that it seems like they might be opposed to each other, but I don't think that that's the case. So how do you interact with those other resources from the tradition?
Yeah. So, and I specifically kind of don't deal with intrinsic evils. I just acknowledge that that's kind of a complicated conversation that draws up a lot of.
Next book, Kate.
Yeah, there we go. But yeah, I mean, I'm saying that there are certain non-negotiables. So I think I'm affirming the possibility of not a wide amount, but that there are moral absolutes, and that that would be another way of phrasing non-negotiable obligations. And so when you are up against multiple of these, whatever they are, non-negotiable obligations, absolutes, there's no way of getting out of what you ought to do as far as that you're obligated to those things. So you make the best choice possible, but there was still this other thing that you had to do. And I also think that some of the dilemma theorists, especially in moral philosophy, like Rosalind Hursthout, she's also, seeing in moral philosophy, in Aristotle, in virtue, that there are some moral absolutes. And so saying that essentially, especially the focus on the tragic dilemmas, which is what Rosalind Hursthouse is saying, they're dilemmas because you can't get out of those obligations. So it's not as if anything goes. It's actually there are certain things that we have to do.
So if I hear you correctly, the very existence of tragic dilemmas depend on the existence of moral absolutes. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yes.
I think one of the things I appreciated the most in the book is the way you draw on the gospel witness to come at describing these moral absolutes. We, as ethicists, we kind of take for granted what the absolutes are, but I think you help us rediscover them in a certain way by going back to the wisdom of the Gospels. Would you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these kind of fundamental, what I've called non-negotiable obligations in Christian thought to human life and human vulnerability arise from the Gospels. I think that, we see that when we look at what Jesus is commanding. We see that in when he's talking about the love of neighbor. Recognizing that humans are vulnerable and that we are accountable to them. That's at the heart of the gospel message. And in fact, I think that they're so demanding that they are non-negotiable obligations that we have to explore. Something like one of the things that I'm taking up is this idea about, whether or not it might be right to kill sometimes, right, as the tradition has suggested, like in cases of war. But yeah, when I read the Gospels, I see both that, Jesus is very clear about what love of neighbor demands, and in our sinful world, we're going to have to do hard things because of these structures that we've talked about and the sin that's in them. And we need to be held accountable for the ways that we essentially did the best we can, but fall short of the commands of Jesus.
Thank you. So the book fills a gap in the tradition, and it fills it in a way that it's truly interesting and constructive. At the same time, though, you do enter in close dialogue with the resources of the tradition, Augustine and Aquinas in particular, and you show that while neither of them affirm the existence of tragic dilemmas as you describe them, both offer us resources to make sense of such aspects of our moral life. What have you learned from Augustine and Aquinas that led you to develop, or at least to find resources for your notion of tragic dilemma?
Well, I started kind of thinking about Aquinas first on this point, and the traditional interpretation of Aquinas is that he would absolutely never have anything to do with the concept of dilemma because he has all of these different ways of being able to make a right choice. And there was a very influential interpretation of Aquinas by Alan Donegan, Alan Donegan, who affirmed that there are no dilemmas in Aquinas, and people are usually looking at perplexus, this idea of a perplexus in Aquinas, and so that we can't find that in Aquinas. And if you look at the examples of perplexus that the people usually turn to in Aquinas, it's the fornicator who can't stop fornicating. It's a problem of somebody the priest is saying mass and a bug or something falls into the chalice, and what are we supposed to do? And that's not what dilemmas are. That's not what people are talking about when they're trying to grapple with these hard things. And I also don't think Aquinas was, that's not where we look to get great insights from a thinker as profound as Aquinas, to grapple with something as difficult as just war. I don't think that we turn over there. And so I was very hopeful that there were other places in Aquinas that would give us a kind of rich entry into his thought on this, because he is a nuanced thinker. And so, really his thought on reflecting on mixed actions is where I come up with what I see that we can do with dilemmas. And so there, he's reflecting on Aristotle talking about throwing the cargo overboard. And I saw your interview with Lisa Cahill, my advisor, and I know that she mentioned this too. That was nice to see, and so in that part, Aquinas reflecting on this incidence of the cargo is saying that you throw the cargo over with repugnance of the will. And so these actions, like of throwing the cargo over, have traditionally been thought of as mixed actions. It's both voluntary, you're doing it, you need to throw the cargo over, it's going to save the ship, but it's also involuntary because you don't really want to, do it. In other circumstances, you wouldn't be throwing cargo overboard. And then Aquinas is calling that repugnance of the will. And I thought, wow, that's very interesting. He's talking about the will, and this seems to be slightly more complicated than people have given him credit for as far as thinking about hard cases. And so I use this idea of repugnance of the will as one of the places to really think about where Aquinas might have a little bit more complexity in acknowledging the problem of dilemmas.
Thank you. Another thing that you emphasize in the book is that you seem to think that the idea of relational responsibility that you have learned from feminist theologians is very important to complement and expand the way as ethicists we think about these matters. Since such an idea plays an important role in your thinking, would you please describe what you mean by it, or what the scholars you are learning from mean by it?
Yeah, so, feminist ethicists had this very important critique of the notion of autonomy that was the predominant notion, which is that, autonomy is an individual agent who makes their own decisions based on only kind of thinking about things on their terms. And feminists came along and said, no, a really thoughtful moral agent is going to acknowledge his or her relationships, his or her embeddedness in others, and it's going to kind of think about that in terms of how to make a right decision. And when we view ourselves as autonomous agents in relationship, we can see how we might have so many obligations to others. And that's really, our obligations to others are at the heart of what it is to be human. And our relationships are so important to us. We're social beings, and those being in these relationships are going to mean that we have obligations to others. Some of these are chosen, some of these are not chosen, some of these arise out of the relationships that we have, and then we need to think about how to act accordingly. And so I really, really appreciate this feminist insight that we're relational beings, and that's really important when thinking about our actions. And in fact, a very thoughtful moral agent is going to recognize that. Where I depart from general feminist thought on this is that I think because of that also we are perhaps more morally responsible in these relationships than we have previously thought. And feminists tend to be much more resistant to kind of expand guilt, especially, that's been used really negatively to in ways that are negative towards women or minorities, just expanding guilt. So it certainly can be problematic. However, I think that when we recognize our relationships, we can see times that we are morally responsible, and then recognize our guilt. But then as Christians also, there's such enormous space for redemption.
Thank you. So you explain that the appropriate response to tragic dilemma is lament. At least that's one of the most appropriate responses to tragic dilemma. Why is lament so important from your perspective? And also, how do we foster lament in a way that might not lead to despair, but instead to healing?
Yeah, so, I see Augustine and Aquinas, they acknowledge lament. One of the unfortunate parts of the contemporary just war that's separated from the thought of Augustine and Aquinas is how much they lamented war. So even when they recognized it as necessary or justified, it was filled with lament for them. And so, this is an incredibly important part of the ethical life, is recognizing sad things. I rely a lot on the thought of Brian Massengale, who talks about lament, and he's talking about it in the context of racial justice, especially in the Catholic Church. And lament allows us to name hard situations, and then the different people in society that have different kinds of responsibilities for those situations can recognize that, because we're naming it so clearly, to sit in the sadness of that, but then that's also a movement of hope. And so it's because we can talk about lament and acknowledge it that we can kind of move forward. Emmanuel Catangole talks about that as well, and I use some examples from his work, that lament this authentic, and he calls it wrestling with God, that breeds hope, because it's this very real kind of relationship. The cover of the book is that you showed, that's a picture of what's known as the suffering Jesus, or the Lithuanian Jesus, and Sean Copeland introduced me to that image, and in the book they chose a picture, but they're generally wood carvings, and they were most found in Lithuania, and it's depicting, Jesus before the crucifixion, Jesus in this suffering, feeling, this sadness. And I think that we cannot, as Christians, we do not need to be afraid of diving into that sadness, diving into these hard spaces, because we know that Jesus will be there. Jesus is there with us. That's where we will find Jesus. And then from there, together, we can kind of move forward and think about how to move forward and what the next steps are. But I think that the lament is really important.
So towards the end of the book, you describe the path of healing as being about integrating the tragic dilemma into an agent's self-understanding, so that the agent may accept moral responsibility for the event on the one hand, but without thinking that the event makes him or her bad or irredeemable. How does the agent achieve such integration? How can the church facilitate such a process?
Yeah, and I think it's really important as communities, as Christian communities, that we acknowledge this category of tragic dilemmas, so that we can be there to respond to people that have been through them, and also acknowledge our own complicity in these kinds of situations. And so that we can heal together, and the Christian community can offer healing, be a site of healing, but also be a site of transformation in itself and in the greater world. So I think the first path towards healing is just being able to acknowledge this category, an inability to talk about moral constraints, and when we're unable to fulfill our non-negotiable obligations, I think is going to go a long way to lead to healing, because we can name this thing. We can name this harm, and once we can name it, then we can start to think of ways moving forward. And again, this is in community, so it's individuals naming it, but it's the community naming it as well, and the community naming their responsibility as well. And so that it's this process together. And then from there, I give different considerations for how a community might think about doing that in their context in the best way possible. And I look at restorative justice and different kinds of things, looking at moral injury healing, just other ways that people have tried to be sites of healing. One of the things that I look at is this notion of, that we can be companions with each other and kind of thinking about moral responsibility, so maybe somebody might not, somebody might wonder, was I in a tragic dilemma or not? That's going to be for them to discern. But we can probably, as Christian communities, be more helpful in that discernment process, right? Be able to have this category, be able to have these discussions about ethics as well as other things, and then kind of be companions as people are figuring that out. So that's one piece of it, is really encouraging individual moral discernment as well as community moral discernment, having those resources available and going through that. And then thinking about the healing as both individual and social. So, what the community can do better as well.
So, in many ways, this is your first book, and it's a wonderful contribution to the debate among us Catholic ethicists and even beyond the Catholic borders. What questions emerged maybe during the book, or avenues of research of pursuit that you could not obviously deal with in the book, but that now are maybe the prompting for future research, for current work? What has this book made you want to think more about?
Well, my current work I'm working on is on moral distress. So related, about how it's related is kind of up for question. And so moral distress comes from nursing literature to describe the situations of nurses who knew the right care to offer, but are not able to offer it due to institutional constraints. That was the original definition by Andrew Jaminton in the 1980s. And since then it's expanded. So thinking about specifically the context of healthcare workers, some of the cases from the book are from bioethics. Obviously, we've had COVID-19. So thinking about, what it means to be a working professional, and there the obligations are your obligations to your profession, and then your obligations that you understand, that your personal obligations, and perhaps you understand that, from your faith life or whatever else. So I'm thinking about how obligations and the complexity of that takes form in the workforce. That's one piece of that. But then also thinking more about the role of community healing, as you raised. So some of the projects I'm working on now are doing empirical-based studies to look at interventions to mitigate moral distress. So that's to give a kind of empirical evidence for, what are some of these strategies that we can use as communities to help people. So that's a very different from the kind of theoretical only that the book was doing. So I think that's really what the book has prompted me to do, to be able to get into another way of researching, another mode of researching, to get some evidence-based interventions that we can give to Christian communities, to think about, how can we support people who have been in hard ethical situations? What does that mean for our own communities?
Great. I look forward to reading the result of this new stage of your thinking and working. So one of the marks of New Wine, New Wineskins is that it's an association that helps its members thinking about moral theology as a vocation, as a practice that ends up shaping who we are as Christians. How has the book impacted you in your life of faith, in the way you live in your faith community? Has it left a mark on you?
I think that part of the book, as I kind of said at the start, was a way of working through my volunteer work and other work that I did as a Jesuit volunteer and elsewhere. So in that sense, it was coming out of, something I felt called to do. I was also a high school teacher for a few years. So that's been using academic theology to reflect on real life experiences and to understand our ethical obligations and to kind of see God in those times, and really to think about that in light of the fact that it can be really hard to understand those situations, but I've been very hopeful that theology can help us to interpret that and those kinds of things. So in that sense, that's one way. And I think that one of the kind of pushback of the book is, this thinking about tragedy, and it kind of makes us feel uncomfortable. And, what does that really, is that saying something negative about theology or even God? And I think that the book and conversations about the book only solidify for me my great faith in God's redemption. And I really do believe that we can acknowledge tragedy, we can acknowledge tragic dilemmas, we can acknowledge our personal and societal failings, and we ought to, precisely because God is a God of redemption. And I really fundamentally believe that. And I am very hopeful for what we can do as individuals and as society and as Christians in light of God's redemptive power. And so this has, really helped me to clarify this strong belief I have, and has helped me, to be able to articulate that and be in dialogue with people about that.
Kate, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. I encourage all our listeners to read and reflect on tragic dilemmas in Christian ethics. And thank you everyone for tuning in. New Wine, New Wineskins continues its weekly Monday post on the Catholic Moral Theology blog. And I will see you in 2 weeks for a brand new episode of the Conversations in Moral Theology. Many blessings and goodbye.